I found out my parents have been secretly paying my sister to ruin my career. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and I've always been a hard worker. My career in finance is something I've poured myself into since graduating college. By some miracle of timing, effort, and luck, I've managed to build a solid reputation for myself in just a few years. I've hit milestones that some people don't see until their mid-30s, and while I don't brag about it, I'm proud of where I am. My job can be grueling at times, but the sense of achievement makes it all worth it. My older sister, who's 32, hasn't had the same luck. She's been bouncing between jobs for years and never seems to stick with anything. Growing up, it always felt like our parents favored her. They'd excuse her bad grades, blame her teachers, and praise her for things like showing up on time. Meanwhile, they were tougher on me. Nothing I did ever seemed good enough, and even when I succeeded, it came with criticism. Don't get cocky, they'd say, or you're only as good as your last win. I guess that kind of upbringing taught me resilience, but it also left me with a sense of being the outsider in my own family. Family gatherings have always been tense. Lately though, things have been worse. At Thanksgiving last year, my sister made a joke about how finance types are all soulless number crunchers who don't know how to have fun. I laughed it off, but it was awkward when everyone else joined in, especially my parents. A few weeks later during a casual dinner at my parents' house, she accidentally mentioned that my company had announced layoffs. She asked if I was worried even though my role wasn't affected. At the time, I thought it was just her way of poking fun at me, but it planted a seed of doubt I couldn't shake. Around the same time, strange things started happening at work. It began with small stuff. Emails that I was sure I'd sent didn't show up in people's inboxes. Meetings I was supposed to attend got rescheduled without notice, and I overheard coworkers whispering about things I supposedly said but didn't. I shrugged it off as office miscommunication until it escalated. I'd been eyeing a promotion for months. My boss had hinted that I was the top contender, and I'd been working my tail off to prove myself. Then, out of nowhere, the promotion went to someone else. When I asked for feedback, my boss said there had been concerns about my professionalism, specifically a rumor that I'd been bad-mouthing colleagues to clients. That hit me like a truck. I would never do something like that. When I pressed for details, my boss wouldn't elaborate. The decision's been made, he said. Let's focus on moving forward. I started to feel paranoid. These weren't random incidents. Someone was messing with me. But who and why? My sister's weird comments about my job stuck in my mind, but it seemed impossible. How would she even know about my work troubles? Still, it was hard to ignore how she kept bringing up oddly specific details about my job. At Christmas, she casually mentioned that my company had a new client in the tech industry, a detail I'd only learned the day before in a private meeting. When I asked how she knew, she just smirked and said she read it somewhere. Meanwhile, her lifestyle was starting to change. My sister has always been terrible with money, yet suddenly she was showing up in designer clothes and talking about a trip to Europe she had planned. When I joked about her glow-up, she got defensive, saying she'd been saving for years. It didn't add up. My parents didn't seem to notice or care. They dismissed my concern, saying I was just jealous that she was finally getting her life together. The final straw came when I found an email on my work laptop. It was in my junk folder and at first glance it looked like spam, but as I read it my heart sank. The email reference to mutual understanding with my sister included vague details about my department's operations. I couldn't make sense of it, but it was enough to push me over the edge. I decided to confront her. That confrontation didn't go well. She laughed in my face and said I was losing my mind. When I mentioned the email, she shrugged and said it must be a coincidence. My parents, of course, took her side. You're working too hard, my mom said. You need to relax. You're imagining things. Things came to a head at work a week later. My boss called me in for a serious conversation. Someone had lodged another complaint against me. This time claiming I'd leaked sensitive information to a competitor. It felt like the walls were closing in. I denied everything, but my boss said the allegations were concerning and hinted that my position could be in jeopardy if things didn't improve. At that point, I realized I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. Whether or not my sister was involved, someone was out to ruin me. I needed answers. I decided to start investigating on my own. Whatever was going on, I was determined to get to the bottom of it. Even if it meant unraveling my family in the process. Update 1. The day things started unraveling, I was visiting my parents to fix their laptop. They'd been complaining about how it was too slow and didn't send emails properly, so I decided to take a look. While I was going through their files, I stumbled across a shared family bank statement they'd left open in another tab. I wasn't trying to snoop, but something caught my eye. A series of consistent transfers labeled support fund sent directly to my sister's account. The amounts weren't small either. It was enough money to explain the sudden designer clothes, vacations, and everything else she'd been flaunting lately. My parents had always helped her out financially, but this was different. The payments had started just a few months before my troubles at work began. It felt like too much of a coincidence to ignore. Later that night I couldn't stop thinking about it. The timing was nagging at me. Could there be a connection between these payments and the chaos at my job? It seemed far-fetched, but everything I'd seen so far felt suspicious. I decided I needed to dig deeper, but I couldn't do it alone. The next morning I hired a private investigator. I wasn't sure if it was overkill, but I needed answers. The pie worked fast. Within a week they uncovered something that left me speechless. My sister had been sending emails to a competitor of my company. These emails contained detailed confidential information about my team's projects, but here's the kicker, they were written as if they'd come from me. My sister had gone out of her way to impersonate me, framing me as the source of the leaks. I felt sick reading the report. Armed with this information, I went back to my parents. I showed them the bank transfers and explained what the pie had found. I expected shock, maybe even outrage. Instead, they brushed it off. They said the money was just to help my sister get back on her feet and insisted she'd never do something so underhanded. They accused me of overreacting and told me to drop it. I left their house feeling more alone than ever. Things escalated further when a coworker approached me at work. They'd overheard someone mentioning my name in connection to the leaked information. Apparently, someone had tried to warn them about me claiming I was untrustworthy. My coworker didn't believe it and thought it was strange enough to bring up. It was clear my sister wasn't just feeding information to a competitor. She was actively working to destroy my reputation. That weekend, I confronted my sister again. This time, she didn't even try to deny it. During a heated argument, she smirked and said, "Maybe I'm better at your job than you think." That one sentence confirmed everything. She knew exactly what she was doing and she wasn't sorry. When I tried to talk to my parents about it afterward, they wouldn't answer my calls. It was like they were closing ranks around her, refusing to acknowledge anything I'd said. It was almost laughable how blatant their favoritism was, but it also raised a new question. Were they more involved in this than they were letting on? I started combing through my own finances and found a few minor withdrawals I didn't recognize. They were small enough that I wouldn't have noticed them otherwise, but they were linked to a family account we'd set up years ago. It felt like another piece of the puzzle, though I still couldn't figure out exactly how it fit. One of my close friends noticed I was distracted and asked what was going on. When I explained everything, they weren't surprised. They reminded me of all the times my family had been manipulative in the past, especially when it came to pitting me against my sister. They encouraged me to stay strong and not let them drag me down. It wasn't much, but it was the support I needed to keep going. At work, things were getting worse. I received a formal warning after another round of fabricated evidence against me surfaced. My boss was running out of patience, and I couldn't blame him. Without hard proof of what was really going on, I was starting to look guilty. Then out of nowhere, I got a message from my sister's ex-boyfriend. He said he had information that could help me. We met up at a coffee shop, and what he told me blew my mind. Apparently, my sister had bragged to him about sabotaging my career. She'd even hinted that my parents were helping her. He didn't have all the details, but he offered to dig through his old messages and emails for anything incriminating. Around the same time, I found something strange while visiting my parents' house. I noticed a few sticky notes tucked into the back of a drawer in the kitchen. The notes were cryptic, but they mentioned my company and referenced dates that lined up with some of the issues I'd faced at work. It felt like a smoking gun, though I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. By now, it was clear this was bigger than I'd thought. My sister wasn't acting alone, and my parents' behavior was becoming more suspicious by the day. This wasn't just a case of sibling rivalry, it was a coordinated effort to take me down. I knew I couldn't let it go. It was time to uncover the full truth, no matter what it took. Update 2. After meeting my sister's ex-boyfriend, I couldn't ignore what he'd shared. He told me my sister had bragged about sabotaging my career, but that wasn't the worst of it. He overheard my parents talking with her about how to make the plan work. According to him, they weren't just aware of what she was doing, they were helping her. He provided screenshots of text conversations he'd saved, where my parents and sister discussed ways to undermine me at work. The texts were blunt and horrifying. They talked about planting false rumors, making me look unreliable, and ensuring I wouldn't get promotions. My dad even suggested timing the sabotage to coincide with major projects at work, knowing it would hit me hardest then. With this evidence in hand, I went to my employer. I didn't show them everything. I didn't want to wear all my family's dirty laundry, but I gave them enough to cast doubt on the accusations against me. They agreed to hold off on any further action against me while they conducted their own internal investigation. For the first time in months, it felt like I might not lose my job after all. At the same time, I started pulling back emotionally from my family. I stopped calling my parents and avoided my sister altogether. I couldn't pretend everything was fine when I knew they'd been working together to destroy my reputation. A few days later, my parents called me out of the blue. They accused me of tearing the family apart and begged me to stop whatever vendetta I thought I had against them. They didn't deny anything outright. They just danced around the topic, insisting that I was misinterpreting things and should let it go. I hung up without saying much. There was nothing left to say. That's when my sister started sending me messages. They started off as sarcastic jabs, accusing me of being too sensitive and playing the victim. Then, they turned darker. She accused me of ruining her life and threatened to expose secrets about me if I didn't back off. It was laughable. There wasn't anything for her to expose, but the escalation showed just how desperate she was becoming. The private investigator I'd hired continued digging and found even more disturbing information. My parents hadn't just been funding my sister's sabotage, they'd also paid off other people to help. This included a former co-worker of mine who'd been encouraged to spread rumors about me in the office. It was a full-blown conspiracy and my parents were at the center of it. Around the same time, things at work started shifting in my favor. A few co-workers who had initially been distant came up to me privately, apologizing for believing the rumors. One of them even admitted they'd heard about my sister's involvement and didn't think it was fair how I'd been treated. It felt like the tide was turning. Then my sister did something that backfired spectacularly. She posted a series of vague passive-aggressive messages on social media. They didn't mention me by name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. She complained about people playing the victim and not being able to handle the competition. The posts were cryptic enough to avoid outright incrimination, but clear enough that mutual acquaintances started asking me if everything was okay. It was the final push I needed to consider legal action. I consulted a lawyer about my options and started putting together a case for defamation and fraud. Between the texts, the financial discrepancies, and the PI's findings, I had more than enough to take it to court. My lawyer also suggested looking into workplace damages given how much the sabotage had affected my career. Out of nowhere, a distant relative reached out to me. We weren't close, but they'd heard about the drama through the family grapevine. They told me stories about how my parents had always enabled my sister, even as far back as childhood. They remembered times when I'd been punished for things she'd done and how my parents had always downplayed her bad behavior. It was validating to hear, but it also reinforced how deep this pattern of favoritism went. One of the most surprising developments came from the competitor who'd been receiving the false information. My PI managed to get in touch with someone from their team, who admitted they'd been misled by my sister. They apologized for the role they'd played and confirmed that the information had been flagged internally as unreliable. This was the final piece my employer needed to clear my name completely. A few days after this breakthrough, my parents showed up unannounced at my apartment. They looked frantic and begged me to forgive them, insisting they'd only acted out of love. They still refused to admit fault though, framing everything as a misunderstanding. I told them point blank that unless they came clean about everything, I was done with them. That conversation was a turning point for me. I realized I didn't need their apology to move forward. They'd shown me who they were and I believed them. From that moment on I decided I wouldn't let them or my sister have any more control over my life. Update 3. The next step was to lay everything out in one place. I spent days compiling every piece of evidence I had, the private investigator's findings, the screenshots from my sister's ex, the texts that connected my parents to the scheme, and the financial discrepancies from our shared account. It was overwhelming to see it all together, but it was airtight. There was no way they could talk their way out of this. I called a family meeting which wasn't easy to arrange. My parents were still ignoring most of my calls, and my sister seemed to think the whole thing was a joke. But when I told them I had something important to share and insisted it was in their best interest to listen, they reluctantly agreed. We met at my parents' house, the usual neutral ground. I came prepared with printed copies of the evidence. As soon as I started laying out what I'd found, the atmosphere shifted. My sister's smirk disappeared the moment she saw the screenshots from her ex. My parents looked at each other nervously when I brought up the bank statements and the notes I'd found in their drawer. The argument that followed was explosive. My sister backed into a corner, admitted to everything in a fit of anger. She yelled that it wasn't all her fault, claiming my parents were the ones who had pushed her to act. They wanted me to even the playing field, she said. You think I came up with all of this on my own? That's when my parents jumped in, trying to justify their actions. They accused me of being too successful and said they just wanted to make sure my sister had a fair shot. My dad even had the audacity to claim I'd left the family behind by focusing so much on my career. They framed their betrayal as love and concern for family unity, but the more they talked, the more it became clear how calculated it all had been. They tried every trick in the book to guilt-trip me into staying quiet. They said this would ruin the family. They claimed I'd regret making this public. At one point, my mom even started crying saying they were only trying to keep us together. It was a mess, but I stayed calm. I told them there was no excuse for what they'd done and that there would be consequences. The next day, I shared my findings with my employer. This time, I didn't hold back. I handed over the full dossier, including the proof of my sister's communications with the competitor and the evidence showing she'd impersonated me. My employer was shocked, but also impressed that I'd handled the situation so professionally despite the circumstances. They cleared my record completely and issued a company-wide statement confirming my innocence. It felt like a weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. Word spread quickly within my extended family. I hadn't planned on sharing everything with them, but someone must have talked because I started getting calls and messages from cousins, aunts, and uncles. Some were supportive, but others accused me of airing dirty laundry and tearing the family apart. It didn't matter. The truth was out, and I wasn't going to back down. Then my sister did something unthinkable. She showed up at my workplace unannounced, demanding to see me. She tried to apologize, but when I didn't immediately accept it, she got loud. Security had to escort her out, and it created a scene that only made her look worse. My coworkers, who had been wary of me for months because of the rumors, rallied around me afterward. They could see now that I wasn't the villain in this story. With my career back on track, I decided it was time to escalate legally. I filed a defamation lawsuit against my sister and began exploring financial fraud charges against my parents for the unauthorized use of funds. My lawyer was confident we had a strong case, especially with the evidence of my parents using inheritance money meant for both of us to bankroll my sister's scheme. The backlash from my parents was immediate. They called threatening to cut me out of their will unless I dropped the legal proceedings. It didn't faze me. I had no intention of relying on them for anything ever again. The situation took another turn when my sister's employer caught wind of her actions. They investigated and found evidence that she'd been using company resources to assist in her sabotage efforts. She was fired on the spot, leaving her financially unstable. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her attempts to even the playing field had left her worse off than she'd ever been. I officially cut contact with my parents and sister after that. There was nothing left to salvage. The betrayal was too deep and their lack of remorse made it clear they'd do it all over again if given the chance. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary. With them out of my life, I started focusing on rebuilding. My career was back on track and my reputation had been restored. Friends and extended relatives who supported me became my chosen family, offering encourage. Update 4. The legal proceedings against my sister and parents moved faster than I expected. My sister didn't contest the defamation lawsuit, likely because she knew the evidence against her was overwhelming. This meant the court ruled in my favor almost immediately. She was ordered to pay damages for the harm her lies had caused to my career. It wasn't a massive sum. She didn't have much left after losing her job, but it was a symbolic victory. As the lawsuit against my parents progressed, things got more complicated. During a financial audit, it came to light that they had been misusing shared funds for years, far beyond what I'd initially uncovered. This wasn't just about the money they'd funneled to my sister for her sabotage. It included other questionable transactions they couldn't explain. The court's final ruling labeled their actions as financial fraud. They were ordered to pay restitution, not only to me, but also in penalties for their broader misuse of funds. It was a harsh judgment. And while they deserved it, the fallout spread quickly. Word about their actions started circulating in their social circle. Friends they'd known for decades began distancing themselves. A few even reached out to me to express their support, saying they couldn't believe the people they thought they knew would stoop so low. My parents went from being well-regarded members of their community to social pariahs almost overnight. I heard through the grapevine that my dad had stepped down from his position on the neighborhood association board, and my mom had stopped attending her weekly social gatherings. While I lost my immediate family, I gained closer bonds with other relatives and friends. Cousins who had stayed neutral during the chaos started showing up for me in meaningful ways. One even offered to help me move when I decided to leave my hometown for a fresh start. Friends who had known me for years stepped up too, inviting me into their families for holidays and encouraging me to focus on rebuilding. My sister tried to reach out a few times. She sent messages claiming she'd changed and wanted to make things right. She said she was seeing a therapist and working on herself. I didn't respond. The damage she caused was too great, and I didn't trust her intentions. Actions like hers don't just happen. They take planning, and I knew better than to let her back into my life. The court ordered restitution payments from my parents and sister helped me recover financially from the losses I'd incurred during the sabotage. It wasn't about the money though. It was about accountability and knowing they couldn't walk away from what they'd done without consequences. Meanwhile, things at work were better than ever. My employer, now fully aware of everything I'd endured, recognized my resilience and professionalism throughout the ordeal. They offered me a promotion to a leadership role, one I accepted with gratitude. After months of fighting for my career, it was gratifying to have my reputation restored and my efforts acknowledged. My parents, desperate and isolated, tried to stage a reconciliation. They sent letters saying they were old and regretful and just wanted to make amends before it was too late. But their words rang hollow. Their actions during the fallout, refusing to fully admit fault and continuing to frame themselves as victims, made it clear they weren't genuinely sorry. I didn't respond to their letters or calls. Moving out of my hometown felt like the final step toward closure. I found a new job in a city where no one knew my story, giving me the chance to start fresh. The distance from my family's toxicity brought a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Within my extended family, lines were drawn. Some relatives supported me, saying it was about time someone held my parents accountable. Others defended them, claiming they were just trying to help my sister and didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. It didn't bother me. I knew where I stood, and I was done seeking anyone's approval. Interestingly, a small local news outlet picked up on the court proceedings. They wrote a piece about the case focusing on the financial fraud and its impact on my parents' reputation. The story didn't name me directly, but it brought public scrutiny to their actions. Neighbors, who had once admired my parents, started asking questions and their facade of respectability crumbled further. Through conversations with distant relatives, I learned more about how my parents had fostered sibling rivalry from the start. Stories emerged about how they'd always given my sister preferential treatment while holding me to impossibly high standards. This betrayal wasn't new. It was just the most extreme example of a pattern that had been there all along. One unexpected ally came forward during the court proceedings, a former friend of my parents. They provided additional evidence of my parents' financial mismanagement, strengthening my case and ensuring the final judgment left no room for doubt. As everything settled, I started speaking publicly about toxic family dynamics and the importance of setting boundaries. I didn't name names or go into specific details, but sharing my experience felt empowering. I realized how many people had faced similar situations and how important it was to remind them they weren't alone. The final court decision left my parents in financial ruin. They sold their home to cover the fines and restitution, leaving them with little to rebuild on. It was a symbolic end to their control over my life, and for the first time, I felt truly free. Update 5. For relocating to a new city was like flipping a page to a completely blank chapter. I settled into a vibrant community full of people who seemed genuinely supportive and welcoming. The move wasn't just physical, it felt like I'd left all the chaos behind. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about running into family drama or defending myself against unfounded accusations. It was a clean slate. Professionally, things were falling into place in ways I hadn't imagined. The leadership role I'd been promoted to in my previous company opened the door to an even bigger opportunity. A prestigious firm in my industry approached me offering a position that not only came with a significant pay raise, but also cemented my reputation as a respected professional. It was a validation of everything I'd worked for, proof that the sabotage hadn't defined me. As my career thrived, so did my personal life. I started building deeper relationships with the people around me. New friends and mentors stepped into roles my family had once filled, but this time the connections were healthy and mutually supportive. I wasn't looking over my shoulder waiting for the next betrayal. I'd replaced the toxicity with something real. Back home, the aftermath of everything I'd uncovered continued to ripple through my family. My sister's financial struggles deepened. Without a steady job and with her reputation in ruins, she struggled to make ends meet. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd tried applying for several roles, but word of her actions had spread and no one wanted to take a chance on her. Her once flashy lifestyle had evaporated, replaced by desperation. My parents weren't faring much better. After selling their home to cover legal fees and restitution payments, they'd moved into a smaller place far from their old social circle. Their isolation was almost complete. Most of their friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with people whose actions had become so public. It was a symbolic fall from grace, one that seemed to echo the loss of control they'd once had over me. They still tried to reach out occasionally, sending gifts and letters with messages about how they missed me and wished things were different. But their refusal to fully take accountability for their actions made it impossible for me to engage. I sent everything back, maintaining the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, the restitution payments from my parents and sister provided a financial cushion I hadn't expected. With those resources, I was able to rebuild quickly, taking steps I might not have been able to afford otherwise. I invested in myself and my future, using the money to make moves that set me up for long-term success. Amidst all this, a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. They'd heard about everything and wanted to express their admiration for how I'd handled it. They shared their own experiences of feeling overlooked and dismissed in their family and said my story had given them the courage to stand up for themselves. It was a humbling moment. One that reminded me I wasn't as alone as I'd once felt. Public support continued to pour in as well. The local news coverage of the court case had painted me in a positive light, focusing on my resilience in the face of betrayal. People in my new community rallied around me, celebrating my ability to rise above the challenges. Their encouragement was a constant reminder that the betrayal, as painful as it had been, didn't define me. One of the most significant milestones came when I was featured in a major industry publication. The article highlighted my professional achievements and resilience, framing me as a rising star in my field. Seeing my name in print, tied to something positive and affirming, felt like the ultimate vindication. It was proof that I'd taken everything my family had thrown at me and turned it into fuel for success. Over time, my sister faded from my life entirely. She stopped reaching out, too focused on her own struggles to maintain any connection. It was a quiet end to a tumultuous relationship, and though it was bittersweet, it brought a sense of closure. As for my parents, they continued their decline. Selling their home had marked the end of their financial stability, and without their old social ties to lean on, they were left to face the consequences of their actions. The last I heard, they were living a much quieter life, far removed from the image they'd once projected. One unexpected moment of gratitude came in the form of a letter from another distant relative. They wrote to tell me that my story had inspired them to leave a toxic relationship they'd been stuck in for years. Knowing that my experience had helped someone else find their strength was a powerful reminder of how far I'd come. Looking back, it's hard to believe everything that's happened. The betrayal, the fallout, the legal battles, it all feels like a different lifetime. But I've emerged stronger, more independent, and more sure of myself than ever before. This chapter of my life is closed. And while it wasn't the story I would have chosen, it's one I'm proud to have overcome.